Okay, so I'm making this video generally for my friend Knockout, but I'm also gonna upload this to my public YouTube channel for the sake of having it as just a general guide for baking for anyone who's new to it. And I'm talking about like good baking, like baking your normals and stuff, not the shitty kind of baking that I see people doing with the bevel shader. Baking is more of a general term. There's a lot of types of baking, and baking could just refer to storing any kind of information onto a an image texture. But for this video, I'm going to be specifically diving into baking your normals from a high poly to a low poly in Substance Painter. I'm going to set a few I'm going to make a few things clear first though. I do not recommend you bake anything in Blender unless you have to. Like if the information you're trying to bake can only be accessed through Blender, then I guess that's fine. But generally, you should only be baking in Substance Painter because it's a lot faster and it's a lot more intuitive. And also, this tutorial is only going to focus on baking from high poly to low poly using the match by name method. I'm not going to go in detail through anything else. And it's also going to be focused on this hard surface model, but it can also be applied to any hard surface model. So there's that. So first of all, preparation. Your meshes obviously have to they obviously have to have a matching silhouette like this. So the low poly and the high poly need to match that aspect of it. And another thing, you have to follow the naming scheme that you have for your project. By default, the prefixes are underscore low and underscore high, lowercase. These are case sensitive, so keep that in mind. You have to have that matching here. And another thing is that these need to be exported in FBX format if you're going to use the match by name feature. Because of some stuff with OBJ and FBX differences. Basically, in a nutshell, FBX can store like all of these names and stuff and have these objects be separate in the file. OBJ can't do that. OBJ just takes everything and stores it into like a text file basically. So there's that. This is also useful if you're using this is also useful if you're trying to bake uh ID like color data from vertex color. There's that. And I think lastly when you're baking anything, you also have to triangulate your mesh beforehand before you put it in Substance. As with everything. That's just a general like rule when it comes to baking, but I mean to texturing, but I just wanted to make that clear. You should be triangulating everything before you put it in your project, because if stuff doesn't match up with the shading, you know how things can like change the moment you know how shading can change when you triangulate stuff. Yeah, you have to keep that in mind. So a good rule of thumb is to just triangulate everything before you put it in a Substance. Oh, and I almost forgot. When it comes to baking, in hard surface, I I mark all of the sharp edges as seams. So if I clear all these seams, these are all sharp edges, and they're all seamed. This is because of a complicated reason. Traditionally, what you would do is you just let the shading of your mesh be whatever it is, and the normal map would override any kind of shading that was on it. And that was fine for the most part, but I discovered that doing that, it makes it so that the mesh doesn't display correctly in some engines because of shading and whatnot. So for hard surface, I just mark all of my hard edges with seams. So that's just a thing that I do. You don't have to do that, but that's a thing that I do, and I recommend you do that as well if you're not sure of the technicalities that you're working with. So make sure, just to summarize real quick, make sure it's triangulated before you export. Make sure the shading is correct, and make sure your names match with your low and high, and make sure they match with the naming prefixes. So once you export both your low and your high poly, they have to be in one file. You export them as an FBX. Once you do that, you just have to go to your Substance Painter. You just have to go to your project file, I guess, and you usually import your mesh. As is with things, but I'm working on a. This is a continuation of a project that I'm working on. These pelters, as you can see, so I'm gonna be editing the project configuration and updating the mesh that it's using. So here we go. So this is what you'd usually see. I'm gonna go ahead and actually change the anti-aliasing level. Oh, never mind. It's already at the max. So now that we're here, you want to go into the baking menu, and you have to configure your settings correctly before you actually like go on and bake all of the mesh maps. So to do that, you just usually with me, I bake the normal map, and then I just like adjust it as I go, and I just keep baking and baking until I get a result that I like, and then I bake all of them. You can do this with any of the mesh maps. I do it with the normal. So you have to select your high definition mesh, high poly. Should show you this neat little visualization. By the way, if you're using any version of Substance Painter before 9.0.0, I think you won't have this. You'll just have the regular like baking thing. You won't actually be able to see any of this. So you have this fancy visualization thing. You want to adjust the max frontal distance. I set it to 0 first, and then I just move it up until all of those red spots are gone. You don't want to like set it as high as you can, or too high, because then it won't bake correctly. So you just try to get it as tight as you can without seeing any of those red like places show up. And this is fine for me because there's actually a split in these meshes, so it's supposed to behave like that. And then for max your distance, you can just set that high. Anti-aliasing, anti-aliasing, that's pretty self-explanatory. That's going to be the anti-aliasing amount on the bake texture. I'm going to set that to 16x. Match, I'm going to set that to by mesh name. The reason why we want to do that is because you have a lot of meshes close together, and if we weren't using match by mesh name, you'd have like a lot of overlapping influences, and that'd be bad for the texture. So you use match by mesh name, or you could also just separate all of them physically in 3D space, but that's boring. I don't do that. It's better practice to just use this method, and then that should be it. Once everything is set up, you just hit bake. Once that's done, you check to see if anything went wrong. If you have like n-gon heavy topology, there's usually going to be a few baking errors, and you'll have to like the fixes on that can vary. It's a case to case basis, but um, it seems here that there are no baking errors, so that's fine. And then once you've got that, you can just go ahead and bake the rest of the maps that you need. And for the rest of the maps, I don't do anti-aliasing. I only do it on the normal map. Yeah, that's baking, pretty much.